Hi, everybody. I'm Nicholas O'Brien. Welcome to our panel for Ludonarracon. I'm so honored and pleased to be here with everybody today. I'm joined by some fantastic artists and game developers. I'm not going to try to introduce all of the amazing, cool things that they're about, but instead I'm going to allow them each to talk a little bit about their practice and a little bit about their process in a kind of conversational manner. So the way that I'm hoping to structure our time together for the next little bit is kind of like brief introductory kind of segments with each one of the panelists. And then for the second half, for us to kind of have a more roundtable discussion. So, I'll give a kind of brief preface that I also just gave to the panelists and that we've been kind of talking about for the past several weeks as we've been organizing this. But today we're going to be talking about this concept or this idea that I've been really trying to work on or develop or theorize that's called essay games. And a brief kind of synopsis of what I mean by essay games is independent or experimental or artistic game projects that are either borrowing from or adapting ideas or methodologies or concepts from essay filmmaking or essayistic filmmaking, from experimental or avant-garde kind of canons, I guess you could say. So when I'm talking about that, you can look at the works of artist and filmmaker Chris Marker or Chantal Akerman, or artists like Hito Steyerl. There's a number of like important kind of precedents for this idea of essay filmmaking. But the way that I've been trying to structure this is thinking about three discrete ways in which game makers or game developers, designers, and artists are using the medium to kind of make essayistic works. And that's going to be these kind of three different categorizations: the documentary, the diary, and the satire. And so each one of the panelists today kind of represents that category, not entirely and not kind of holistically. And I think that their work speaks to a lot of different methodologies. But I'm going to try to talk about each one of their work underneath one of those categorizations. So I'm joined here today by David Cribb, Nathalie Lawhead, and Angela Washko. And I'm so pleased to have them today. We're going to start. I would actually love to start with Nathalie to talk with her, because her kind of, again, a lot of her work, I think, is into this categorization of the diary, and I'd really like to start there. So Nathalie, so great for you to be here, and again, so glad to see you. I just would really like to start with talking about, what does your like development process look like? You have, being familiar with your work before, you've worked in various different contexts within like a games industry. And I'm wondering, with your more recent projects, what are some of the ways in which you like even get started on a project or start thinking about developing a project?
With each one, it's kind of different, but I like to come up with stuff that seems really new or unique or kind of fills a untouched on niche. Like with Everything Is Going to Be Okay, that one was kind of brewing for a long time. Like I wanted to talk about my own personal experiences in a way that's relatable and kind of speaks to others, because like I feel like I'm not the only one that's had these kind of experiences in working with games or just in life. So I wanted something that is a game that's extremely relatable, but also kind of funny. Like it makes you laugh at these horrible things. So, I mean, that one is interesting because it started as a series of illustrations on Post-it notes, and then I shared it on Facebook, and people are like, "Oh my God, this is hilarious! It's so fucked up." So it kind of grew into a game from there. So, yeah, that was that one.
Cool.
If that, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I just I had to unmute. Yeah, that's like really interesting. This idea of like starting from like sketches, right, as a way of like thinking about the development process. And you talked about this project, Everything Is Going to Be Okay, which you've kind of described as well, I feel like I don't want to put words in your mouth. So like, how would you describe that project, like in terms of like the structure of that project?
A series of vignettes about life, a dark comedy, and they're kind of strung together in a somewhat cohesive manner, where if you play them in order, one kind of leads into the other, but it's also meant to be able to play out of order and you get your own experience from there. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really call my work structured. It's not very structured. It's very random and bizarre.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I guess that like that wouldn't be like the greatest phrasing because it is like I'm really glad that you use that reference of like a vignette, right? Because these feel like and everything is going to be okay, right? Like they feel like pages, right? In fact, I think that they're referenced as pages, right? In
Yeah,
the
yeah.
project, yeah. So they're like pages, like that that don't necessarily have like a linear flow to them, though that they all have kind of like similar content that is like deeply reflective and somewhat like I mean not somewhat but like pretty self-effacing at times, right? And pretty, I would say, like self-critical or self-analytical, but still trying to make light of it in this really kind of dark comedic way. And I was wondering, like, was there a particular like reason or rationale or like method that you felt like that was just like a really good way of approaching the content of that work?
Yeah, I feel like games are a really interesting way of kind of portraying or getting across personal messages in relatable ways. Like even while you're playing something, it becomes personal to you, and there's a disarming aspect to it. Like, and then if you throw in the comedy into it, it's kind of like you can't be upset while playing it. It's just weirdly relatable to in any degree. And I mean, it was really interesting, like a lot of people's reactions to it, even guys that might not have had these experiences found it relatable, or kind of it helped them understand people with mental going through mental struggling with their mental health. I'm sorry, I'm rambling if that answers any of your questions, but
No,
yeah, it's
I was just gonna say absolutely. I think that I love what you said about like this idea of relatability, right? And like using comedy or like using like the format that you use to kind of, I don't know. To me, I feel like that project is such like a kind of earworm, which is like a maybe a weird way of like describing it, but it really kind of like gets into your head in a way where you're kind of looking at the project kind of subjectively almost, right? You're looking at it like, oh, this person or this character is like having an experience, right? Or maybe they're trying to work through trauma, or they're trying to work through, like you said, like difficulties with mental health, right? But over time, as you kind of go through more and more of the vignettes, you start, or at least I did, I started having these experiences of being like, oh yeah, I know that feel, right?
mhm,
Or
yeah.
like, yeah. So I didn't know if that was like, you said that there was like this relatability to that format. And I was just wondering if you wanted to talk about like how people are giving you feedback about, that kind of continued relatability.
Um, like it, I generally don't get a lot of feedback from it unless I see people playing it, but it's usually really interesting to watch how people play it. Like they'll laugh, cry almost, like they'll laugh their ass off and they get really quiet for long periods of time, like, and then they'll start laughing again. So it's interesting. I really feel like it's this. One of my friends described it like it's a slow grind on you until there's like nothing left but just to laugh or cry at it. So I feel like that's really unique to games though, because the fact that you have to interact with a thing or solve a problem in a thing, or just the fact that you are participating makes you responsible, and it becomes kind of like a grind. It gets to you, it has to in a way get to you, and you are responsible for the outcome
Mm,
of a situation. So it's kind of like it becomes part of your life experience. I mean, like you get that in any, I don't know, any type of game you play it. The way you remember playing it, it's part of your personal history now. Like, with me and my dad playing games on PlayStation, when we describe some kind of battle we had with monsters, it's part of our history now. It
mm,
didn't really happen, but it's something that did happen to you. So it's this weird abstract realm that games exist in when we try to recall our play experiences. So when you talk about alternative work like the alt game scene,
Hmm.
it's a really interesting dynamic, like because they're already so bizarre, but you're part of this bizarreness, and it's weird, personal, kind of poetic realm to place people in, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I love that idea of a game becoming part of your personal history. I think that that's like so beautiful and poetic, and I haven't really heard it phrased that way. And I feel like that that's also something that's really like central or core to this idea of like an essayistic diary, right? That like you're reading someone's personal account of their experience, but through reading it, right, it becomes part
Mhm.
of your own personal account, right? Or
Yeah.
becomes the way that you associate or the way that you, yeah, like kind of relate to that experience or relate to that individual or relate to your own personal like experience with that. I don't know. I didn't know if you were kind of thinking about that as also being kind of a central part of what you worked on with that project.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely was because I wanted people to kind of internalize some of these messages, especially I don't know, because it had stages it went through. At the beginning, it was supposed to be just abstract and you can read yourself into it. But then it kind of got into the less comfortable part of games where people started attacking it for whatever feminist messages or being different and weird. So I felt like it had to become more clear. I had to do something to make the message or what it's supposed to be more clear. So I added in the update was the personal essays
Mm,
about different aspects of my life that were more clear about what this might be about and where this kind of making light of trauma is coming from. So it kind of it changed it a bit, but also I feel like it made that more relatable or harder to tear it down because it's clear now, like, yeah, don't be a bro about this. This is about some serious heavy shit, you know?
yeah.
So yeah, I feel like at the beginning it might have gone wrong because completely abstract probably doesn't work in the game medium yet if you want to, you know, communicate serious
Mm,
issues.
mm, mm. Um, well, thank you, Natalie, so much for telling us about that like development process. I want to make sure that we are able to loop in other developers, and again, I think we're going to have a lot of stuff to chew on when we come all back together with your work and how it relates to other projects. So thanks.
Yeah.
So I'd like to now bring David in and say hi and welcome so much. Or welcome so much. That's not a thing to say. Welcome and thank you so much for participating. Um, so David, you kind of represent again, not to shoehorn your work into a specific category, but for me, your work really, I think, embodies this documentary methodology really, really well. And I know that we've been kind of going back and forth a number of times this past couple weeks that we've been organizing this. But I'm really thinking about like two projects in particular that I think really highlight that kind of documentary approach. And those are Post Capital and your most recent project, Hand with Many Fingers. Um, and so I was wondering for you, if I'm going to try to start with again another kind of open-ended question. How does your process start when you're thinking about approaching game making, and how does like your research process, right, seems so integral to how you're also developing your games?
Yeah, so pretty much all of my games have started just directly inspired by like something I'm reading at the time, like some piece of theory or some piece of political economy or that type of thing. Um, and yeah, just sort of imagining how that could fit into a world of gaming. Um, so with Hand with Many Fingers, I think the immediate inspiration was reading some stuff by Douglas Valentine about history of the Central Intelligence Agency, all of that sort of juicy stuff. Which then, yeah, thinking about how to represent conspiracy narratives in video games, how to map that type of conspiracy research onto video game mechanics. Um, and in terms of sort of the longer term research, I found that I tend to just sort of read very intensely about whatever topic I'm making game about for the first, I don't know, month or two of development, and at that, usually by that point, I have far too much material to work with, and just desperately try to cut things down over the ensuing months.
Yeah, cool. I like that. I think that's so much about like essayistic approaches is, and this kind of ties into the diaristic approach too. But it's kind of like pursuing like I would say like organically pursuing interests, right? You're kind of like you get something like catches your attention. And you're like, ooh, there's something there that like needs to be delved into further, or there's like an interesting history there, or there's an interesting subtext there, or there's something interesting about that experience that a game would really like be a good affordance to. And I'm thinking about different other kind of documentary based games or documentary essay games that really think about how history is represented, right? And how history is way more mutable, right? It's not just in a book or in a recount of a kind of literary recount of it. That experience can be very linear or very straightforward or just kind of like purely fact based. But in a game like Hand with Many Fingers, all of a sudden you're starting to like unravel that history yourself, and you're starting to like, I don't know, without using this word too cheesily, like you're trying to embody, right, what that experience is or potentially was like. And what's beautiful about a game is you can kind of present the myriad of what that experience could be, in one project as opposed to like a single path. So I was wondering, when you're developing a Hand of Many Fingers, which is about conspiracy that has many, 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 many tendrils, right? How you go about like then encapsulating that in a game, right? Because it could kind of unravel quite quickly.
Yeah, I suppose I feel games are a very well adapted medium for that type of conspiracy narrative, because as you say, it's good conspiracy stories aren't just you start at the beginning and you work your way up to the present, and you just hear how things happen chronologically and get those sort of clear explanations. It's more you start with some incongruous detail, and then that points you off in other directions, points off on other connections and that sort of thing. You start spotting patterns in all of the information you're viewing, start putting together connections that you might not otherwise realize. And so that sort of investigative process is something which, I think games are very well adapted to reproducing. And something which I think more closely mirrors the experience of a conspiracy investigation or a conspiracy film than necessarily sort of how a standard historical textbook would be set out or something along those lines, because they're more directly following these points of interest.
Yeah, totally. And, that's something that I think is really a kind of central tenet, maybe, of like thinking about what essay games are or what they can be. It's really thinking about how telling a story, right, doesn't necessarily require like sequential order of facts, but that it really relies on the mechanics of like experiential storytelling, or like mechanics of like being in the place and like what simulation does, right? And there's something that I think that's really interesting or funny about the Hand with Many Fingers, because the experience is like, it's kind of like, it's like research. It's kind of like a slog. You're like, oh, I have to like reference this file number, and I need to like, I can then substantiate this file with this other piece of information, right? By cross-referencing things. But in doing that, there's kind of this like interesting subversion that's happening with like what games do really well, which is like a series of like for lack of a better term, like repetitive tasks, right? That then like add up to something really significant or meaningful, right? And so I think that there's like this other meta layer that you're working on with the Hand with Many Fingers, where you're kind of thinking about the experience of like collecting information itself within a gameplay. And I didn't know if you wanted to like talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I guess on that, one of the things I realized recently is that the structure of the research is like much closer to researching conspiracy theories on the internet than it is actually doing archival research. Like the way the archive is set out sort of makes no real in-world sense. It would be a nightmare for actual researchers to deal with. Um, but it's closer to that idea of uh, yeah, finding a particular lead of this name and this date and this location, and searching that up. And so, yeah, closer to reproducing that sense of uh, tracking down names on the internet or that type of thing. Um, and yeah, to your point of using the sort of repetitive research actions as a way of building into the narrative. Um, yeah, I think that's definitely something I've been going for. And on that point, I've been trying to draw in lots of genre elements from all of the classic conspiracy movies of the 70s and 80s, All the President's Men and Parallax View and all of those classic films. Um, and trying to uh, bring those kind of elements of paranoia into the moment to moment actions of researching in the archive and that kind of thing. Um, which, yeah, I think also is just an added way of building the sense of immersion and creeping dread and paranoia around the actual sort of core material of the narrative.
Yeah, I want to just maybe I I got a chance to play a build of your most recent project, and I wanted to touch on that idea of increased paranoia, because there's this beautiful moment for me. I think this beautiful moment that happens in A Hand with Many Fingers where the phone rings. So for people that haven't had a chance to play David's game, you're playing as a researcher, going through archival material to try to kind of map out this conspiracy. And it's fictionalized accounts of real world conspiracies that the CIA has conducted these, terrible acts of um, financing various puppet states across, the globe. Right, David? This is like a pretty good summary.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. But what happens is that there's this wonderful moment where the phone rings. So you're playing in a completely solitary state where you're just going through archives and collecting material, and the phone rings at this kind of staging area that you have. And it rings while you're outside of the room, and it just has this lingering, eerie sensation to you. And when you pick it up, there's no one on the other end, and it has this lingering, eerie sensation to you that I think really encapsulates what is kind of beautiful about essayistic storytelling, which is, again, going back to what we were talking about with Nathalie, experiencing something or playing through an idea, right? It then you start to feel like you belong in that world, and that the idea starts to also kind of come apart at the seams somewhat, right? So in David's project, this idea of mapping out the space, right, is a way of embodying, you know, conspiracy theory kind of research, and that engendering a kind of paranoia. And then the game shows you that paranoia as a gesture in and of itself, right? So when you play that, you kind of, or when the phone rings, you're kind of like, oh my God, someone's watching, right? And that experience is like so, I think, unique, right, to storytelling within games, right? David, can you talk about, like, I don't know, that just seemed like such an amazing point, and it's so subtle and so like poetic.
Well, yeah, I suppose the focus of all of those kind of moments of creeping paranoia and that kind of thing was, yeah, I wanted the player to have a more embodied sense of the creepiness and paranoia of this conspiracy. Because, yeah, when you're just sort of reading these dry documents or reading it in old history textbooks or that sort of thing, it's very easy to just sort of say, oh yeah, that's normal. This is what the CIA does. This is the world we live in. But I think by adding elements of horror and paranoia and that sort of thing, it actually gets the player to focus more on these events as like real world events, not just purely sort of dates on a page or that kind of thing.
Right, totally. Cool. Well, thank you again, David. And I'd love to be able to move on to bring Angela Washko into the mix. Angela, hi.
Hi.
Hi. So Angela, again, kind of going on this little structure that I've tried to create here for us. A project that you worked on, that you made, an art game, I would say, that you made called The Game, is, I think, a really great encapsulation of what this kind of the satire track is. And I think it borrows, obviously, a lot from some of the stuff that we were talking about with David in terms of research methodologies and thinking about documentary-based storytelling. But the important kind of twist, right, is in a satire, instead of kind of representing those facts or kind of even fictionalizing, semi-fictionalizing those facts, you're trying to expose that research in order to kind of undercut or upend, right, the intended purpose of those messages, right? Does that like jive with you?
Yeah, that was great. I wish I hope that this is being recorded so I can like write that down later.
Yes, I think, yeah, it definitely is being recorded, so you're welcome. But I would love for you to talk about like maybe the genesis, right, or the starting of that project, because for me, I think it shares a lot of what has already been said, but then how you took that and made the game to game is, I think, an interesting distinction.
Well, first off, I want to say to David, I love the term nightmare research because I can relate to that. But yeah, my practice, so the starting of the game, I mean, I come out of a background of being an artist who kind of is always thinking about what the right form is for the research and content and story that I'm interested in. So sometimes that manifests as performance or performance in virtual environments and in games or video art. And sometimes it's written work and other times it's games. But yeah, with the game, I had spent 4 years inside of World of Warcraft doing this performative intervention called the Council on Gender Sensitivity and Behavioral Awareness in World of Warcraft, because it was a game that I played for a long time and had become increasingly frustrated with the way that women, members of the queer community, and players of color were socially treated in that space, and try to create this kind of discussion platform / collective protest in that space. And as I was talking to other players and trying to figure out why the space had become the way that it was, I realized that a lot of my, I guess, peer players in that space identified as members of the manosphere or as pickup artists or followed all of these different like self-identified seduction coaches and seduction gurus. So that sort of led to a longer term investigation into, how the manosphere and how pickup artists and seduction coaches kind of get their audiences. And how they end up developing their own methodologies and how these methodologies relate to, other practitioners. Why one pickup artist approaches pickup art this way, and why another one takes another person's writing and sort of spins it in a more extreme direction. And just as a femme presenting person who had experienced, for a long time, going back to the diary sort of trajectory, like a a long span of time having like my personal space invaded by men who felt entitled to it. I think even though the game is based on the very real practices and strategies of pickup artists. It's sort of a reverse dating simulator where instead of choosing from a bunch of great options of interesting figures that you would like to date, instead you're just trying to find your friends, and you keep being sort of your space keeps being invaded by men who want to perform their pickup artist practices on you. It's still, even though it is based on all of this research on the specific practices of these pickup artists, it's still coming from, you know, a personal perspective on, you know, the ubiquity of these practices and how they kind of disseminate beyond these like sort of cartoonish caricatured figures. So
Yeah, totally. Yeah. That was the thing that I wanted to pick up on there, and that was a really bad turn of phrase. The thing that I wanted to just like kind of reiterate, I think, and I think that that's something that's really important about the game in terms of a kind of work of narrative too, is that all of the text, right, of the game is directly taken from material, right, from how could you say, promotional material or coaching material or online material of these people, right, of the pickup artists themselves, right?
yeah, it's from their like books, their like public conferences they do,
Yeah, the
and
seminars
and then also their video coaching materials.
yeah, and so that to me, I think is like where your project might be slightly different, or maybe your research methodology is slightly different from Natalie and David. Is that by kind of like taking the words themselves, right, and representing them in the context that you described, right, this femme presenting context of having your personal space, you know, continue to be infringed upon. It then like kind of upends, right, all of that material, right, or it undercuts the use value, I would say, of that material, and instead it becomes like a work of fiction, right, or it works as a piece of narrative storytelling, right? Can you talk about like please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think even just so all of these materials are in their original kind of design are meant for an audience of men who are trying to figure out how to interact with women. And so they're designed from the perspective of these coaches, how to do things to women, on women, etc. And so just, I think even just by flipping the perspective, in terms of experiencing these practices, you know, just having them like sort of happen, it really changes the way that these practices are understood and received. And I think also just, you know, when this is happening in a you know, a physical public space, when somebody is moving you around in a bar to try to move you away from your friends, or this is a common strategy that each of the pickup artists you can interact with does this. You know, on its own, when that happens, you know, you're just like, oh, somebody's moving me to, you know, it's too loud or something like that. But once you start to see it and slow down all of these practices, because I think time is a really important element of the game. Obviously, when you're in a bar, you can't say, hold on, what just happened? Let me analyze this gesture. But when you're playing the game, you know, once this starts happening in repetition, it stops being something that is like a casual gesture and starts to feel like something that's structurally significant and like designed to be manipulative. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but those are some of the, like, I guess, mechanical shifts that I think, yeah, change the meaning of the original material.
Right, and that original shift then becomes like comedic, right? I mean, there's moments in the game, which is, you know, at the forefront, a game that has a lot of kind of content warning material, I would say, and a lot of material that could potentially be triggering for people that have experienced the kind of either physical or emotional violence, right, that comes from some of these practices. But there are also these moments in which, when that's represented to you, right, you're like, oh, this is either really laughable, right, or really pathetic, or really just bizarre, right? So by kind of like telescoping into the words themselves, right, and the way that those words kind of like stack up in a sequence with your project, they just kind of resonate so much differently than they would if they were just like given to you in like a video promotional material.
Yeah, I have two quick things to say to that. One is that it was really important to me that nobody experiences this game who don't know what they're getting into. So the providing context for where this original material comes from. I'm not interested in anonymizing the pickup artist coaches and seduction coaches. I'm not interested. I'm interested in holding them accountable. So all of that context before you ever play the game. So nobody goes in, not knowing what they're going to run into is really important to me. And then the other thing I feel like I failed to mention is one of the most important, I feel like, interventions on the material that I have is getting to write the sort of the femme presenting person that you're playing, their choices, their options. That's something when pickup artists are writing these materials, they're like, she's either going to do this or she's going to do this. And when she does that, then you do that. And if she does this, then you do that. And there's not a lot of room for complexity or even, So anyway, I think I'm trying to build in opportunities to identify in ways that, are question the biological determinism embedded in the field, and so on. But yeah, I think that's an important, I guess, intervention that I have into the material.
Yeah, totally. I would love to open this back up to all the presenters, since I feel like we have a lot of content and a lot of shared stuff that hopefully people have felt like has resonated with each other. But I want to actually like maybe just ask a question to the other panelists too about this notion of time being so important, right? Angela, you mentioned this, Natalie, you mentioned this, and David, I feel like each one of you talked about time being such an important element of what gameplay, right, does, right? And maybe I can direct this towards Natalie first, right? Because again, you said that like there's periods of time, right, where people are just sitting and staring at the work and really absorbing and digesting what's being said. And I wonder if that element of time is really important in how you think about either developing your project or how you think about different narrative arcs that you're creating in your piece.
Yeah, definitely. Like there is a lot of thought that goes into kind of managing time, like if you just interact with it very briefly, it's just a silly cartoon-like thing. If you interact with it longer, it starts getting deeper. So how do you pull in people and how do you keep them engaged long enough so it starts getting deeper? I feel like any developer, and it's especially with personal stuff, how do you start communicating these things in a way that's not overbearing all at once, but they start getting it in a kind of a slow drip so it's digestible? Yeah, like I don't know, it's interesting then with these experiences, they start to become haunting the longer people are with it. Like with Angela's The Game, when I heard people play it at festivals, like I didn't play it myself because I wasn't ready for it, but it was really fascinating. Like when guys came and played it and they told me about it, like it was haunting. Like they had experienced something that they couldn't really get over with, like it stuck. So it's kind of like the way you develop makes something haunting.
Yeah, Natalie, that's like such a great way of phrasing it, and I think that's like that kind of that tightrope, right? That SA Games kind of walks between, really delicate nuance, right, and like gamification engagement, right, is like such an interesting balance to develop for. And David, I'm wondering if you could talk about that balance with your own projects, right? That's kind of maybe an open-ended place for you to start.
Yeah, well, I guess One point which kind of fits into that and the discussion of time just before is in Hand with Many Fingers, I was sort of really going for a kind of sharp differentiation in like the tempo of the game between the office where you have your corkboard and twine and sort of assembling theories and that kind of thing, and the archive itself. And so having this sort of shifting tempo between the office where you're sort of constantly looking over things and trying to find new connections and trying to find new ways of fitting pieces together, and then the archive where you are just navigating to, I need to go and find this box and come back with things. And so I think having that kind of shifting tempo within a game, I found that a very effective way of like giving people room to breathe with this kind of material and room to just like mull things over, and sort of advance the narrative at their own pace.
Yeah, what I think is like maybe like a good encapsulation of that too is like this idea that like if you were a researcher, right, performing these tasks, right, you would never jog to your to the archive, right? But in the game, right, there's a moment where it's like hold shift to run, right? And to me, that there's like that space, right, that interstitial space between your kind of the corkboard, right, where you're piecing all together all this information, and then going into the archive itself. That's literally like this kind of interesting transitional space where you are doing that processing, right? And I think that like that gameplay element, right, of like running to your next task, right? It's like, to me, it feels like such a Western or something. That in every kind of Western, stick with me, in every kind of Western, there's like the sequence of the interstitial sequence of them riding horses to their destination, right? But that moment in that film is really important, right? Because it's like processing all of the stuff that's going on. And it's maybe trying to also communicate in a weird way, like the way in which the characters might be processing their next task or the battle ahead or whatever it might be. And so to create a space, and again, Angela's project does this too, right? Where you create a space where there's moments of contemplation, right? And those moments of contemplation are so important within gameplay or within narrative structure that oftentimes I think like AAA games tend to ignore, or they try to like expedite, or they're like, oh, let's just fast travel to the next location, right? So Angela, since you kind of took us down this path, I was wondering if any of that like resonated with how you went about developing your own project.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about what you just said about pacing and time for reflection. And yeah, I mean, I think, how do I want to say this? There's a design claustrophobia in my game that I think, how do I want to say this? It's at time, you can kind of pause, and sometimes there's intentional time to reflect on the experiences that you've had so far, to allow you to sort of pick up on relationships between the figures that you've encountered. But then there are also times where things really speed up quickly, and even though you can make the decision not to advance, there are things about it that is designed to compel you to keep going toward finding an outcome. But I don't feel like I'm explaining this really very well. But I think I was very inspired by Anna Anthropy's Queers in Love at the End of the World, in the way that she uses time in that game, the way that it's such a meaningful part of that experience, and really shifts the way that that you, it also affects the replay of that game so much. And I think for me, it was important to design the game in a way that even though the figures are reprehensible, I do feel like it compels you to continue to play, to see some of the other outcomes, especially the outcomes that allow you to kind of have more agency. So anyway.
Totally. totally. So we're running close up to time, but I want to allow the presenters to plug anything that they're working on, or anything that they've recently released, or anything that they're still developing. David, obviously, we've been talking about A Man with Many Fingers, but Nathalie, you just released an ARG project that I'd love you to get a chance to plug.
Yeah, if you search Alien Melon, it's like my first thing that shows up on my profile. It's like a ARG about being an internet archaeologist, and you dig through this forgotten website to find this mystery fish and kind of follow in its tracks. And yeah, you find there's a cute little reward at the end.
Cool. Thanks. Angie, did you want to say something to that?
Yeah, I mean, please do check out the game at thegamethegame.org. It's also, there's the NetArt anthology, Rhizome's NetArt anthology has a lot of research and history behind it there. And also I have a documentary film that I've been working on for 2 years following amazing drag queen named Mrs. Kasha Davis and her life before and after getting cast on RuPaul's Drag Race, and that should be coming out in the fall. So Workhorse Queen is the name of that film.
Cool. Thanks, Angela. And David, please, if you'd like to pitch anything or plug anything.
Well, yeah, Hand with Many Fingers is coming out at some point, some undetermined point. But yeah, would strongly recommend people check out Nathalie's ARG. I thought it was really brilliant.
Awesome, cool. Well, thank you all so much for participating, and thank you for viewers of Ludonarracon and Fellow Traveler and all of the organizers of this conference. It's been a really great experience, and cool. I think that's going to do it for us tonight. So thanks so much, and bye. Bye.
Thanks, Nicholas.